this man had a heck of a report yesterday that caused me to say, let's get him on this show. I always want him on this show, but this one in particular about Brian Flores. There were elephants in the room and dolphins in the room yesterday, apparently, talking about the Watson trade for draft picks, but not for Tua. So many questions about this. Jeff Darlington of ESPN back here in the Rich Eisen Show. How are you, Jeff?
What's going on, Rich? Always a pleasure.
Always a pleasure talking to you. All right, so walk me through what happened in the Dolphins locker room, best you can tell, yesterday.
Well, pretty simple, Rich, and how we interpret it, which we will certainly try to do, is probably more complex. But in its simplest form, Brian Flores went into his team meeting at 4 p.m. a day ago, and he did something that he doesn't normally do. He addressed the reports that have tied the Miami Dolphins to a trade for Deshaun Watson with his players and his staff present. And he did so by keeping it pretty brief, but also being pretty poignant and saying that Tua Tagovailoa is our quarterback. That's it. That's end of story. That's what he did. I guess the question then becomes, of course, why is that important? And my biggest takeaway from it is that this is not the same as Cam Newton saying after they draft Mac Jones, Cam Newton is our quarterback, only to a few months later, Bill Belichick waiving Cam Newton. It's not the same to me as Cliff Kingsbury saying Josh Rosen is our quarterback right now. And the difference is those were being said in press conferences. This was a head coach standing in front of his players where his integrity and his honesty is more important than anywhere else, telling them that Tua is our quarterback. I'm not saying it has anything to do with what has happened or what will happen, but at this moment, Flores made clear that Tua is his guy.
Well, the reason why that's important in my mind, first thing I thought of when I read your tweet on that and heard your reporting on it, Jeff, is that the coach had to have heard enough. I'm not saying Brian Flores is out there watching, the Rich Eisen Show, Get Up, Sports Center, NFL Total Access. I'm not saying that, but enough had to have reached his ear gate, to use the Miami legend Michael Irvin's phrase, to feel compelled to address it with his team, gather around. And maybe some of that chatter was in his own locker room, and he felt the need to have to just put it to bed because they've got to face Bill Belichick in a week and a half.
That's right. And honestly, it sometimes I think when coaches do put their head in the sand, they're forgetting that the players in their locker room are smarter, more aware than maybe they realize. Of course, players in that locker room, including, by the way, Tua, had to know what was swirling out there. And one of the things that I made clear on Twitter and have in subsequent reports is that this is not intended, what I'm saying here is not intended to dispute, for instance, what Charles Robinson, someone who I respect greatly and have known for a long time, what he reported. It's these two things are not mutually exclusive. I believe that Flores going in there and saying Tua is our quarterback is not an indication that the Dolphins were not, and perhaps in the future will not be interested in trading for Deshaun Watson, but rather, to your point, look, we're less than 2 weeks before the start of the season. Yes. And if you've got your quarterback and the people around him wondering what the head coach thinks about him, you got to address it. And he did just that, and I give him credit for it.
And I give him credit for that. And the question does beg, though, Jeff Darlington, based on all of this, is why the Dolphins still were tire kicking on, yes, a supremely top 3, potentially top 5 talent at the most important position in not just the National Football League, but maybe all professional team sports. Got it. But it's not just that alone. All things are not equal with Deshaun Watson. And for them to tire kick on that mere weeks, days, if you want to put it, before a regular season and think that it's not going to get out, because you also have to wonder, you also have to wonder why they would do that, because there are other teams in on it. And
Right.
you can't guarantee other teams. Certainly, if I was another team in on it and then didn't get the guy, but the Dolphins were, I would totally leak it just to throw that grenade into the Dolphins locker room before the season. Absolutely. Why would they do it? Why would they do it?
So, two things there. The why, I think you answered in the way you sort of introduced Deshaun Watson's resume in terms of being a generational talent, a top player at a position that's the most important position in sports. The problem with that is, so that's why it makes sense, if there is any sense to be made of this, why an NFL team, a coach, anybody, whoever it was within the Dolphins organization would be willing to pursue and kick those tires. I think oftentimes, as we've seen so many different times, look, I covered the Dolphins for years. I remember when Jeff Ireland got on a plane, I was covering the team at the time, with Stephen Ross to fly across the country and interview Jim Harbaugh while Tony Sperano was still his coach, and was surprised when that ultimately got out. Like, sometimes you dangle a carrot in front of these teams and they don't necessarily think about the crisis management that comes, the repercussions that come with those actions. In this case, you're absolutely right. There is so much more to Deshaun Watson than his resume. So the why, the only thing I can tell you is that the why there would be interest is that we're talking about a generational player, and football teams, whenever they have an opportunity to look at a player like that, they often cannot help but do it.
Jeff Darlington of ESPN here on the Rich Eisen Show. And again, in light of the fact that the head coach of the Miami Dolphins felt compelled to gather the team together, based on your report, that they gathered the team together to say that the quarterback is their guy, right? That's not optimum. That's not what you want, obviously, ever, just a couple weeks before the season.
Right.
That said, what if it had worked? What if the trade had worked? What was the then what for the Dolphins? Like, what was the then what?
That was my big question all along. I couldn't, and maybe it's not fair. I mean, maybe it is fair. I don't know. I don't know where we're at with this. But, like, to me, sitting there saying, what happens if you do make that trade? Right. You have Tua in the building. You haven't decided what's going to happen to him. The next day, there's a grand jury indictment. Deshaun Watson goes on the commissioner's exempt list, and you're looking back at Tua saying, hey, bud, you want to hop in there, take some snaps? I don't know. Maybe there's more of a plan there. You know, whatever the case, I guess at this point we're supposed to simply say, and I'm not sure what's fair and what's not, that it didn't happen, so we don't have to cross that bridge. But I'm with you. There were certainly a lot of questions that would have come along with it.
Yeah, I mean, you pointed out the grand jury aspect of it, but the more likely result over the next couple of weeks and months is one that the Texans are going to have to now deal with, which is probably why they were trying to get him off their roster.
Right.
Is that this thing would have hovered, and that, you know, where the Texans aren't starting him, they might, what's the word for it, Keyshawn him? I don't know if that still is the proper word for it. Just
put him on the shelf somehow.
Right, put him on the shelf somehow. Like, right, the Dolphins would have done that, and still Tua would have had to have get in there, or they would have started him, right? And then what? So even if you get through the season and the questions of why are you starting him, like what happened, he'd be out in front of a press conference, something like that, and then or even crazier, you start him, you get through all of that, you win, and then 2022 he's not your guy because of all this stuff coming out of nowhere. I just can't compute, and I know we're moving on, and we will, because there's a big Dolphins, Patriots game, the Alabama Bowl, Tua versus Mac, but right. I still just can't move on yet, because where your reporting is about the aftermath of it not happening. What would have been the aftermath of it happening? I still don't get it.
Maybe it's, and I'm not trying to be by any means. I'm not trying to excuse them or anything like that, but I guess the one thing I would say in the defense of the Dolphins is that they could have made the trade and did not. And perhaps that's ultimately the reason they didn't.
Right.
Was they looked at that and said, well, we really, this really doesn't make a lot of sense. To which you would say, wouldn't you sort of be proactive in that planning, realize that, not, even pursue it to the point where other teams find out and it gets leaked out? That, I think, sometimes is the type of, do we call it crisis management, that we should think about as teams before you engage in these actions. But I think it is at least fair to say we can't crucify them for something they ultimately decided not to do. You can say, hey, my only thing here is, like, if you're Brian Flores and you're upset about the quote-unquote distraction, that annoys me a little bit when you see him call it a distraction. Well, that's self-imposed. That is created by actions. It's not like I could say Stephen Ross, the report that came out that Stephen Ross was driving the train, that's a distraction, because I'm fully confident, based on conversations I had before yesterday, that was not the case, that Stephen Ross is not sitting here pounding the table for Deshaun Watson. That, I guess, could be, but otherwise, distractions are often self-imposed.
Jeff Darlington here on the Rich Eisen Show. That's an excellent point that I'll be honest, I didn't think of, that the trade was there on the table and the Dolphins just said, we don't want it. Although word is that the Texans still refused to have pick protections for the acquirer of Deshaun Watson, which is nuts. Like, that's...
Here's a wonder, though, Rich. If let's take away the elephant in the room with Deshaun Watson, which is the 22 civil lawsuits. What would a team would give up 3 first-round picks and 2 second-round picks in a heartbeat for Deshaun Watson.
But Deshaun Watson might not be made. Well, Deshaun Watson would have been made available because of the circumstances on the ground between mid-January through the first allegation to be made public, right? So I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt.
This would have happened. The deal would have happened before the draft, but it honestly probably would have been 5 first-round picks for a generational quarterback. So maybe these teams are simply saying we could potentially get Deshaun Watson at a deal. Once again, though, the problem with that is the conditions that deal comes with. I mean, it's like buying a car that you can't even look at, and I don't know. It just doesn't feel safe. It doesn't feel smart.
Well, then let me leave it with you with one last question, Jeff Darlington. Let's talk about the elephant that's still in the room, based on last year's performances of Herbert and Tua. The fact that Tua is not the best quarterback in that draft and will never be. And the Dolphins already know that. The guy that they fell in love with when he looked off a safety for Alabama in a national championship game isn't that guy. And that's what they believe. And that's why they're tire kicking a guy with more baggage than LAX right now, despite his incredible talent, just a couple weeks before the season. What about that?
Well, and that is where I think you get into perhaps the contentious conversation internally, which is, who is Tua, what is his value, and is he our franchise leader? There are people that you know what the wild part about this, not to turn this into what fans think, because as much as I love fans, their opinions don't.
Careful,
really
don't go Javi Baez on me. Don't go there. Don't twitch there.
It's a
don't
thumbs
go.
Up show, Jeff.
Please, it's a thumbs up show, Jeff. Go for it.
I'm only going to say that I have never, I live in South Florida. I've been down here for 15 years.
Yes.
I've not seen the type of support that has followed Tua, despite what I would call a pretty mediocre rookie season. I totally get what you're saying about Justin Herbert. And, by the way, Joe Burrow, who's somehow been suddenly forgotten because of a knee injury. But they could have gotten Herbert. They couldn't get Burrow. But there are people in the building who truly believe that Tua just needs some time to develop. And he needs at least another season to prove that. So while I get what you're saying, and clearly there are some questions based on the actions of the organization, there are still those who believe that Tua will ultimately be the franchise guy. And by the way, what about that story if after this offseason, what's happened, Tua goes in there and proves that he is, in fact, a franchise quarterback for the Miami Dolphins?
Jeff, what a great chat. I knew it would be, as always. Greatly appreciated. Let's get you back on. Let's get you back on every so often. Look for my call, please.
Thanks, Rich.
Thanks.
Appreciate it, man.
You bet. That's Jeff Darlington of ESPN, formerly my colleague at the NFL Media Group. Hey, you watched all the way to the end. Thanks for that. Watch more right here.